In today's video, I'm going to be breaking down my full process on how to create my Rotoscope goal animations, from drawing out players, creating the goalposts and pitch lines, and adding some cool little effects to make it look more like a traditional hand-drawn animation. Let's begin. Just a quick message guys, if you like this video, make sure to click the like button and hit the subscribe button, it really helps out the channel. Cheers! Hello everyone, my name is Elliot, also known as Eliano, and today I'm going to walk through how I created this goal animation of Leeds United superstar Rafinha scoring his last-minute penalty against Crystal Palace earlier this season. The software I used to create this was Adobe Premiere, Adobe Animate, Adobe After Effects, and EbSynth. Step 1. Cutting down your footage. The first thing you need to do is to bring your footage into your video editing software. In my case, I'm using Adobe Premiere, and I've simply just dragged my video file into my project media tab here, and then I double clicked on it to have it appear in my source monitor. After this, I've created a new sequence by clicking this notepad icon here and made my settings for my sequence at 1920 by 1080 at 25 frames per second and named it clip 1. Then I went back to my source monitor and decided to select the first shot that's going to appear in my final animation. In this case, it's the static wide penalty shot of Rafinha scoring the goal. I simply just marked the in and out points using these two icons, which by doing this means I'm marking both the beginning and end points of my footage. And then I'll just simply drag that onto my timeline by dragging this video icon here onto our sequence timeline. And then, as a result, the clip is now in our sequence. Now I'd repeated this process for 3 different clips, with them all labelled clip 1, clip 2 and clip 3. You could bring all of your shots into one sequence, but I find this process a lot simpler and neater when using EbSynth. Once my 3 clips have been edited and placed into their own individual sequence, I can then render them out as a H.264 MP4 file, so I can then bring them into After Effects for some final tweaking before we start rotoscoping. Step 2. Using Rotobrush. Now in After Effects, I've imported all my clips by adding them into the project tab here, and then from there I've added each of my video files into their own composition, matching both the dimensions and the length of each video. Now from my experience of using EbSynth, which I'll be getting into later on in this tutorial, it works much better with the background cut out from the subject of your intended animation. That way there's a lot less glitching and artifacts when your EbSynth sequence has been rendered. So as an example, for this shot, I'm basically going to separate all of the elements I intend to animate within our animation, which will be Rafinha, the goalkeeper, and the ball. To do this, I'm going to duplicate our video layer in this composition and label it Rafinha, as that's the subject I want to appear on this layer, and then I'll double click on our new layer to make it appear in its own tab within After Effects. This then gives us the option to use the Rotobrush tool. What this tool allows us to do is we can cut out our subject by drawing around the sections we want to keep and also drawing around the sections we want to remove. Simply click this icon here and then make sure that the version selected is version 2.0. And then all you need to do is start drawing around the subject like so. The sections you click on in green will be what appears on your layer. To remove sections, hold down the Alt key, which will then turn your cursor red, and that section will then be removed from your layer. And what you want to do is to make sure that each frame of your video only shows your subject. And by clicking the spacebar, the Rotobrush tool will automatically go through your footage to cut out your subject, though you may need to go through frame by frame yourself to get the best results, as it's not completely accurate if your footage isn't in the highest quality. If you want to learn more, I highly recommend checking out my previous rotoscope animation tutorial, where I showed you guys how you could mimic my style by using just the Rotobrush tool and the fill effect in After Effects with no plugins or presets. I repeated this process for all of my subjects, which then shows them all on separate layers. I then exported all 3 individual layers as transparent PNG sequences and put them all in their own individual folders, so that way they can be brought into Adobe Animate and then later on used with EbSynth. Step 3. Setting up frames for EbSynth. Once I've rendered out those PNG frames of our subjects, I'm going to now create a brand new Adobe Animate project at 1920 by 1080 pixels and at 25 frames per second to match the dimensions and frame rate of the video clips we've been using so far. Once I've created my new document, I'm going to import my rendered PNG files of our subject onto the first layer by clicking File, Import, Import to Stage, and selecting the first PNG in the sequence. You'll then have this window appear, and after clicking Yes, all of the rendered PNGs will appear in the timeline as an individual keyframe. I then renamed this layer as footage and locked it by clicking this padlock icon here. And to make our PNGs a little bit more visible, I'm going to change the background colour by changing the stage colour in our document settings tab here. I'm going to make it a dark green so it doesn't blend in with the colours I intend to use for my subject. Now I'm ready to draw my first keyframe. First I'm going to add a new layer by clicking this icon here and label it to the section I want to draw around. In this case I'm going to label it shirt. I'm going to double click our layer name here, which will then allow us to select all keyframes on our layer, and then right click over the keyframes and select convert to blank keyframes. That way the drawing on that individual keyframe won't be repeated onto the next. Then with the brush tool selected, by clicking the B button, I'm going to choose the colour I want here, and on the first frame of this shirt layer, I'm going to begin tracing the outline of the shirt. And then by clicking the K button, or this icon here, I can use the fill bucket tool to fill out the outline I've just drawn. This process is then repeated for each section I intend to be drawn, such as the shorts, boots, socks, skin, etc. If you want more detail on this process, please check out my previous Adobe Animate Rotoscope tutorial where I use Adobe Animate to create this Kylian Mbappe animation. Now with this keyframe being completely coloured in on every single layer, I'm now ready to export this frame so I can bring it into EbSynth. But first I'm going to hide our reference footage, that way it doesn't bleed into our final exported image. Once I've done that, I'm then going to go to File, Export, and Export Image. Make sure the file is set to a PNG with transparency enabled, and then click Save. From here you can select the folder you want the file to be saved into and its file name. I would recommend saving each individual keyframe that you render into its own clearly labelled folder to avoid confusion. Also make sure the file name contains the frame number of the PNG we used as reference for that keyframe. For example, we used the first PNG keyframe as our reference for this drawing, and that keyframe was numbered 00000. So I'll make sure that this file contains that number. If these numbers don't match when brought into EbSynth, it may not work as well as intended, so make sure that your numbers are aligned. And so now we are ready to render out our first sequence in EbSynth. Step 4. Using EbSynth. So now that I've got my first fully illustrated frame of my subject rendered out, I'm going to use this cool free piece of software called EbSynth to save me some time drawing out multiple keyframes in this animation. You can download EbSynth using the link in the description below. After you've installed the software and open it up, you'll be met with this window and 3 selection boxes. Here I'll need to add my own reference PNGs that I rendered out in Adobe After Effects, and the illustrated image of our subject that I just created in the last step. Let's start with the reference frames. Click on the select button next to the video layer and locate the first of your rendered PNG frames from After Effects, and then click open. Next I'm going to click the top select button here on the keyframe layer, and here is where I need to select my illustration of my subject. And now with those sets of images imported into the software, I can now choose where I want my render to be sent to. Once again, I'd recommend that everything is clearly labelled and put in its own individual folder to avoid confusion. And with that, I can click Synth and EbSynth will start rendering out my animated sequence. What this software is going to do is going to create its own PNG sequence using my illustrated keyframe as reference attached to the PNGs I rendered out in After Effects, essentially trying to stick the colours on the sections of my subject frame by frame. And now that that's rendered out, I'm going to import it into my Adobe Animate project on a brand new layer, just like I did with my reference PNGs earlier. And then by clicking the Enter button, I'm able to preview what my animation is looking like. And looking through my first render from EbSynth, I'd say it's done a pretty good job from one illustration of my subject. But with it not quite being there in certain sections, in the next step I'm going to go through some little tips that you can do to improve your animations in Adobe Animate. Step 5. Tips to improve your EbSynth render. Now the first thing you need to do to improve the accuracy of your EbSynth render is to make more illustrations in Adobe Animate and import them into the software. So for this shot of Rafinha, I created a few more illustrations and exported them out based upon where my original render started glitching out. Now I imported each of my individual illustrated keyframes into EbSynth into its own folder with the same number as the frame referenced, just like in the previous step, and then imported those rendered PNGs onto a new layer clearly labelled to show which render I'm using. And then I just cut out the frames in my timeline that I didn't need, and with each render I got a little bit closer to having the look I was going for. Now one thing you can do is create all of your illustrated keyframes first, export those PNGs into the same folder, clearly labelled with the frame number referenced, and then select them all when picking your keyframes in EbSynth. And the software will then use this information based upon the keyframe numbers and your reference footage PNGs and attempt to merge it together as best they can. I personally didn't do this, as this is a relatively short shot and I only wanted to draw out the minimum amount of frames. But some of the effects you can get through this method is very good, but it just means that you may have drawn a load of frames that were unnecessary and will still have to draw more in order to fix the glitching that can occur. Now, after drawing a few more illustrations and from there creating a few more renders from EbSynth, I decided I'm going to touch up the rest of my rotoscope animation frame by frame in Adobe Animate. Now, you don't have to do this, you can just keep making EbSynth renders until it looks the way you want it to, but if you want certain frames to look as accurate as possible, I find this is the best way, even with us roto-brushing out our reference PNGs earlier so none of the background colours get glitched into our reference footage. So I personally find this the best way to do it, using the EbSynth renders as a base layer and then going through each frame and drawing over the sections that have been glitched, where I simply just draw over just like I did with my illustration in the previous step. I'll use the brush tool to trace around the area that I want to be cleaned up, and then I'll just use the fill bucket tool to fill in that outline. Once again, for a more detailed breakdown on how to do that, check out my previous Adobe Animate Rotoscope tutorial where I show this frame by frame method. But essentially it's just going through every single frame and just neatening up every section. It sounds like a very laborious task, but honestly it doesn't take that long and the results look a lot better. And after tweaking a few more sections, my Rafinha animation is now done. And to make my process simpler, I started a new Adobe Animate project for my other subjects within this animation. This is because the more PNGs you import into your Adobe Animate project, the larger the file size is going to be, and therefore it can run a little bit slow, so I would recommend creating a separate project for each subject that you're drawing. For the ball, I just needed to do one render in EbSynth, and then I did a little bit of frame-by-frame animation tracing towards the end. But with this just being a simple shape and using one colour, this literally only took a few minutes to complete. The keeper was a little bit more difficult, but I think it shows why you should combine EbSynth with the manual drawing by frame method. Most of the renders look fantastic and just needed a little bit of tweaking, but when we get to this section here, it looks a bit weird. Now this isn't due to some glitch, however. This is because we have another player in front of the keeper in the actual shot. So even after using the Rotobrush to select only our keeper, it's only partially showing him. So in order to complete the drawings of the goalkeeper, I needed to fill in the sections of where his body has been cut out. So by doing the frame by frame method, you'll get good practice for how your subject's body looks, but this also means you'll have more options on how you want to edit the final cut of your animation. For the close-up shots, I just went in and traced frame by frame. The glitching from my renders was just a bit too much hassle for me to work with. I find that this software isn't great for footage with lots of fast movement and motion blur, so keep that in mind when you choose your shots. But again, this didn't take as long as you would expect, and one thing you can do to actually halve the amount of time that you need for these shots is just halve the frame rate. Go back into Adobe After Effects, re-render out your PNG frames or the H.264 MP4 file, because you can import that as well, and just make it, instead of 25 frames a second, make it 12.5 frames a second. Why halve the frame rate? I'll get into that more when we reach our final step. But now that I've sorted out all of my subject animation, now let's add some really cool little features that help pop these animations, the pitch lines and the goalposts. Step 6. Animating pitch lines and goalposts. So now I'm going to make my pitch lines and goalposts. Similar to creating my animation frames, this will have to be done frame by frame. To do this, I'm going to set up a brand new Adobe Animate document, set at 1920 by 1080 pixels, with a frame rate of 25 frames per second to match my shot settings. And from here I'm going to import my MP4 render of my shots that I created in Adobe Premiere earlier, as I don't need to roto-brush out any certain sections of this footage. I'll do this by going to File, Import, and Import Video. Then, when this window appears, I'll select the third option and click this File Path button here, and then find my video. And then by clicking Next and Finish, my video will appear on its own layer in my timeline. Next, I'm going to create a brand new layer, label it Pitch Lines, and convert my layer frames to blank keyframes. Now to draw out my illustration on this frame, instead of using the brush tool, I'm just going to use the pen tool. I'll make sure that my stroke color is set to white, and I'm also going to make sure its size is 7 pixels, and make sure that these boxes have been ticked as well. And then it's just a simple case of joining the lines dot to dot until all the pitch lines have been drawn. I did render out this frame and bring it into EbSynth to see if it would work, but unfortunately there were just too many glitches, so I just stuck to my traditional method, which is to go through frame by frame and draw out the lines individually. And then on a new layer, I did the same with the goalposts, but just increased the thickness slightly. And once completing that, I'm now ready to bring in my animated elements into Adobe After Effects. So all I need to do is render those files out and then bring them in for some final tweaks. Step 7. Exporting from Adobe Animate. The export settings I'm about to show here for my pitch lines and goalposts are the exact same settings I used for my subject animations as well. Quick tip, I make sure that any reference PNG frames have been deleted from my timeline before rendering, as sometimes Adobe Animate will render out those images as part of your exported file. So I would recommend saving your Adobe Animate file and save a separate version where you have deleted these unwanted PNG frames. I then go to File, Export, and then Export Video/Media. This box will then appear, and then I make sure the Ignore Stage Color box is ticked, as well as the entire movie option is also ticked. I then select my format as a QuickTime file, and then make sure the preset is left on default. Then you pick the folder you want your file to be saved to, and then simply click Export. Now after doing that for all of my files, I'll bring those QuickTime files into my After Effects project by creating a new composition at the same dimensions and frame rate that I've been using throughout, and drag them in one by one. I will start with the pitch lines first at the bottom of my composition, then followed by the goalkeeper, then the ball, and then Rafinha. And now I'm ready to add my final tweaks in After Effects to complete this animation. Step 8. Final tweaks. Now the next thing I'm going to do is add a net behind my goalposts in this shot. To do this I'm going to create a brand new shape layer with its fill colour set to white and then move that to the bottom of my timeline. And then I will use the pen tool to draw out the shape of my net, aligning it with the goalposts and back pitch lines in order for the shape to look like a goal net. And then I'll change its opacity by clicking the T button with the layer selected and change it to 20%. And to change the position and size of the net on each frame, I'll open up my layer properties by clicking this arrow, then doing the same for the contents options, then open the shape properties and then the path properties. From here I can add a keyframe by clicking this stopwatch, and then at any frame I can move the shape into the position I want it to, and a new keyframe will be made and the points that I've drawn out will transition between each other. So I went through my shot frame by frame and altered the net and size accordingly. Once I did that, I added a background colour to the shot by adding a new solid layer, coloured green, and then placed that at the bottom of my timeline. I then trimmed down my composition's duration by marking beginning and end points and then clicking Trim Comp to Work Area. I then did the same thing for my two other shots, placing them in separate compositions and using the same solid layer as a background. I then dragged all three of my shot compositions into a new composition called Full Sequence. Following this, I then created another composition, this is the last one, and set it to 1080 pixels by 1080 pixels so I can drag my full sequence composition into it. This way I can edit my animation so it looks better when posted on social media without having to edit all of my shots individually. From here I added some position keyframes following the movement of my animation just by simply clicking the P button and using the stopwatch. This included adding some easing on this section here where the shot pans towards Rafinha just after he scored, and then once I did that, I then added a video file which just contains noise specks on a white layer and then placed that to the top of my timeline. To make it blend in with my scene, I changed its blending mode to multiply. If you're working with a film grain or noise layer that has a black background, instead of setting it to multiply, set it to screen. This way my animation features some subtle roughness to it, similar to hand-drawn traditional animation. Now remember when I said before you can always just halve the frame rate of your rotoscopes when drawing them out to save you time? Well, that's because right now in this composition I'm going to halve the frame rate of my animation. Why? Well, to make this animation seem more in line with traditional animation, halving the frame rate gives it a more classic feel to it, as it will simulate this animation being drawn on twos, or drawings being done every other frame. This was a technique done by animators to save time animating. The only reason why I didn't do this at the beginning is because I wanted to see how good these pieces would look in 25 frames a second, and personally I feel halving the frame rate makes the overall animation look much better. And also, you can add a cool little effect which will help change the edges of your frame slightly in order to make each frame look a bit more unique and organic, adding a subtle boiling effect to your animation. To do this, I'll go to Layer, Add, New, Adjustment Layer. And then I'll add that effect called Turbulent Displace. This will add some bumps towards the outlines of my animated shots. I'll make the size 2 and the amount 15, and then I'll alt-click over the evolution stopwatch here and add in a little expression in my timeline which goes time times 100. And then when I scroll through my timeline, you'll see there are subtle changes to where these bumps appear in my animation. And to halve the frame rate, I'll simply add on the same adjustment layer a posterized time effect here, and then change the number to 12.5, which is half the frame rate of the 25 frames per second I've been using throughout this process. And then I'll place this adjustment layer at the top of my timeline, and then from here I think my animation has a much more traditional look to it. And then to finalize my animation, I will add my watermark and end card animation to it, as well as adding my audio, including my music choice. Quick tip when you're adding your own music to these sort of videos, if it has a drop to it, make sure the drop comes in just as the ball has entered the net for the most impact. And once I render out this composition, my animation is now complete. And that is the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, guys. If you did enjoy this video, make sure to click that like button, as well as leaving a comment. And also, if you really want to keep up to date with all the videos I'm going to be uploading on this channel, make sure to click the subscribe button with the notification bell enabled. And a massive thank you to everybody who has subscribed so far. This channel is currently on around about 900 subscribers at the time I'm recording this, which is absolutely insane. I really do appreciate everybody who's been leaving comments and subscribing and all that lovely stuff. It really does mean the world to me. And yeah, hopefully it won't be too long before my next upload. But as always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Cheers.